113 years ago, approximately, the first contact was made with the Newfoundland people from across the waters. Since that time, there's always been a clash. There's always been a clash of opinions. What did it take you to realize what Indian people have been saying? We have been saying that it's dangerous to unbalance this earth.
For at least 150 years, conservationists have been fighting to protect wilderness from development and exploitation. They have carried on this struggle in all parts of Canada and the United States, expressing their passion for the natural world through unceasing argument and demonstration. This demonstration in April 1984 is about an island on the west coast of British Columbia. What I want to know is what you're doing this for. I mean, what are you doing here?
Mears Island, it represents one of the last wilderness areas in British Columbia that's untouched. And now we find that it's going to be logged and logged in a way that will destroy the wilderness characteristics forever. And we want to see to it that that doesn't happen.
You're a businessman, though. Isn't logging important?
Well, logging is important, but tourism has the overtones here. We got 700,000 people visiting us. They don't want to see logged off areas. They want to see the mature virgin forest of British Columbia. And here, on this road where we have Pacific Rim National Park, it's absolutely important that we keep Mears Island green.
But isn't timber important too?
Oh, timber is important. In what sense, though? A tree is important to me as a person. I enjoy trees. I get a release from my job in the city by going out into the forest. I mean, to me, that's essential for my well-being as a human.
Conservationists believe that civilization needs wilderness for its sanity and health. It is an idea that began to take root in North America in the middle of the 19th century. The earliest settlers from Europe had no doubt that the wilderness was the enemy of their burgeoning civilization. They turned their remarkable energies to taming forest and plain. The axe became the symbol of their strength and determination. But not everyone was pleased by this onslaught. In the 19th century, many notable artists accompanied the Western expansion and celebrated in their work the mystery and grandeur of the landscape. In the 1830s, the artist George Catlin became one of the first men to plead for a halt to the destruction. In melancholy mood after witnessing a brutal buffalo slaughter, he climbed a hill in the Dakotas and recorded the hope that some of the wilderness might be preserved as a nation's park. The feeling that important values were being lost was crystallized by the New England philosopher, Henry David Thoreau. He had lived by himself for 2 years at Walden Pond near Concord, Massachusetts, observing nature and reflecting on it. In 1851, he said,
"I wish to speak a word for absolute freedom in wildness. In wildness is the preservation of the world."
Thoreau's idea has been the underlying belief of conservationists ever since. Much of the New England landscape which Thoreau so loved was already terribly damaged by human actions. These denuded hills were the childhood environment of George Perkins Marsh, a Vermont academic, naturalist, politician, and failed businessman. In 1865, Marsh wrote Man and Nature, the first book to sound a severe warning about the effects of human beings on the earth. Marsh was influential in bringing back the forests to the hills of New England. He's known as the first ecologist, and his influence has lasted to the present day.
The importance of wilderness is that it's basically a place in the ecosystem which all plant and animal communities can interact in a way that they can't interact in an artificial environment. And once we lose that touch of interaction, natural interaction, we as a species may become endangered as a result.
The ideas of Thoreau and Marsh stimulated a growing movement to conserve nature that achieved rapid results. In 1872, Yellowstone in Wyoming was set aside by Congress as the world's first national park. These ideas quickly spread into Canada. The new railway passed by some hot springs at Banff in the Rockies, and in 1885 the Canadian government reserved 10 square miles for a future park. Prime Minister MacDonald hoped the park would both recuperate the patients and recoup the treasury. At the suggestion of the first superintendent, George Stewart, the park was extended to cover the Bow Valley, and by the year 1900, Canada had a nucleus of 4 mountain parks set aside, which were popular for skiing, skating, and for lounging fashionably in the fresh mountain air. 2 competing ideas were built into national parks from the beginning: to preserve beautiful places and to make them available to the public. Conservation and tourism have been uneasy partners in the national parks ever since. The decline in wildlife, especially of the bison, was already a matter of concern before the turn of the century. On this subject, the ideas of the second superintendent, Howard Douglas, ran far ahead of public opinion and made Canada a leader in the field. Douglas was largely responsible for the government's purchase of 700 bison from Montana and for creating a special national park for them near Wainwright, Alberta. He snatched these animals from under the nose of the American Bison Society. This was a notable act of conservation. Yet in those days the understanding of wildlife biology was rather rudimentary, and Douglas's concern was not extended to all animals. The wolf was never a favorite, and when Douglas drew up his regulations to control hunting, protection was not given to predators in national parks. The idea in those days was that deer, sheep, and goats were good animals, and those that killed them were bad. Not only wolves, but cougars, coyotes, lynx, wolverine, even some birds could be eliminated from national parks at the superintendent's discretion.
Set aside as a national playground by the Government of Canada, Jasper National Park is today a sanctuary for wildlife.
For many years, films about national parks never mentioned these bad animals and never admitted they were being killed.
The stillness of the primeval wilds is never broken by the sound of a hunter's gun. As a result, the bear, the deer, the caribou, and the moose have become friendly to man in this humanitarian domain which can truthfully be called the animal kingdom.
The role of predators was not properly understood until the 1930s, when the policy was abandoned. The headquarters branch of the parks could still fit into a small Ottawa office when it came under the leadership of James B. Harkin in 1911. For the next quarter of a century, Harkin ran the parks. He carried on Douglas's work for conservation, creating 3 small reserves for the endangered pronghorn antelope, helping their numbers grow in 3 decades from a few hundred to more than 30,000. But there was still no great body of public support for conservation, and Harkin had to deal with a rather skeptical public. Historian Fergus Lothian.
Generally, officers from Ottawa regarded with a little bit of suspicion in the western towns like Banff and Jasper, and I'm told that on one of his trips west he sat down in the lobby of the Mount Royal Hotel picked up the local newspaper and was either horrified or delighted to read the following paragraph. J.B. Harkin, Commissioner of Parks, is in town. Who the hell cares?
Well, Harkin cared. He had a clear vision of what Canada needed and seized every opportunity to create new parks. For many years, the national parks were confined to the Western Mountains, but slowly Harkin extended them into eastern Canada. He created Point Pelly in Lake Erie as a national park as a measure of protection for birds. Point Pelly had always been a favorite place for hunters, and from early times was under pressure from motorized visitors. The fragile environment of the point provides a major staging place for the migrations of the monarch butterfly and for a host of bird species, and illustrates perfectly the tension between conservation and tourism. Tourism depends on the preservation of the natural landscape, and this was recognized in 1930 when, after 10 years of effort, J.B. Harkin persuaded Parliament that national parks should be preserved unimpaired for future generations. Finally, the public had caught up with the pioneering work for conservation of Harkin and Douglas, two outstanding civil servants. The mandate to develop facilities in national parks was there from the beginning. The CPR began to build their famous hotel only 2 years after Banff was set up. There was never any doubt that Canadians must have access to their own parks. The automobile and railway required new roads, whose building was undertaken with enthusiasm.
Men took up the challenge of the mountains. Across the rivers into the rocky passes came surveyors and engineers. They brought precision instruments to map passes and measure gradients. The crash of falling trees echoed in the gorges as axemen cleared the way. A new age had come.
Though the parks no longer build tourist towns like Banff, that was part of the early mandate, and much of the work was done during the 1930s by unemployed workers who, from their relief camps, built a playground for those more fortunate than themselves.
The swimming pool, with its pure spring water, heated to a comfortable temperature, is a never-failing attraction. Here, water sports in many and various forms are the watchword of the day.
There's some critics who feel that mass tourism has overtaken the conservation aspects of parks. Pat Thompson, Director of National Parks.
I don't believe that. Tourism, is important. Without tourism, there would be a body of the public who wouldn't be interested in the parks. So those parks are set aside for use and enjoyment, and we are required to make provision for the so-called tourists to come and see the park. The primary mandate is conservation.
During the 1930s, the national parks hired Grey Owl, one of the strangest figures in Canadian history, as a full-time propagandist for conservation. From his small cabin in Prince Albert National Park, Grey Owl earned an international reputation. Only after his death was he revealed to have been Archie Bellany, an Englishman pretending to be an Indian. But Grey Owl had an immense impact. Though his films today are curiosities, his books are still in print, and he did help save the beaver from near extinction. His two tame beavers, Rawhide and Jelly Roll, became world famous. In the 1930s, beaver had almost entirely disappeared from the northern parts of some provinces. With their survival in doubt, many beaver were captured, tagged, and transplanted to other parts of the country. As in the case of the buffalo and antelope, the national parks, and Grey Owl, helped bring about the remarkable recovery of a declining animal. The making of the early parks on unoccupied Crown lands in the west was easier than it later proved to be in eastern Canada. When Cape Breton Highlands National Park was set up in 1936, a provincial government had to acquire title to land that had been occupied for many years. By now it had become part of the conservation idea that people destroyed natural values and must be removed before a national park could be established. Those who were expropriated in Cape Breton moved away without significant protest, but in this practice lay the seeds of future trouble. The momentum for new parks was slowed in the 30s, halted in the war, and given low priority after the war, when Canadians were preoccupied with economic development. In these years, Canada's cities reached out greedily for new land. But some voices were raised in defense of natural values. A century later, the arguments of Thoreau's day were replayed, again by a small minority. Dr. George Ledingham of Regina University.
You know, here we are in the middle of a prairies, and it's a rich thing. We produce wheat, feed the world. But when people come to Saskatchewan, they'd like to know what it was like before it became a monoculture. And so we thought if we could save a bit of grassland to show distance and expanse and grassy hills, and maybe even have bison and a few of the things that are already lost from Saskatchewan. I grew up on the cereal farm, and I find beauty in a waving field of wheat, but I think there's a precariousness about it. It's subject to rust and smut and insects of various kinds. And so I think, thinking of the long-term future, we have to try and preserve the native things.
Among the many creatures that suffered in this determined drive for production were the prairie dogs.
This is the only place in Canada where there are any prairie dogs. And, you know, they could be so easily poisoned out by the ranchers, who, of course, think of them as competitors with the cattle. So we did, at the very early part, urge that the prairie dogs be given complete protection. And since we couldn't get that, we bought a quarter section. We actually leased a quarter section just for preservation of prairie dogs.
But in the early 60s, the general public were still more concerned with their summer vacations than with preserving animals, and the parks went all out to attract them.
Want to get away from the city, see the girl, she's oh so pretty. The gentle breeze caresses the trees and rushes softly through her hair. It would be fine if she were mine. She's a part of nature and time.
Look, a black-capped chickadee. There, can you see it? Take my binoculars. An interesting bird, this chickadee. Would you believe it? He sometimes hangs upside down when searching for insects. A very interesting bird.
Interesting indeed, that chickadee. But then, much of the film material put out to advertise the parks over the years is a treasure trove of visual and verbal cliches.
In the fresh, cool air of Jasper Park,
camping out is one of the best ways to become acquainted with the park's inhabitants.
feats of endurance and skill under the constant supervision of bronze instructors.
Largest mammal of the mountain parks, the bull moose, sets off for a day's foraging. He leaves his cow and calf by themselves during the summer, and at noonday we find them calmly grazing on luxurious water plants. Then they use their antlers in fierce battles with other stags. Nimble-footed, they climb from crag to crag, where they can be spotted by the sharp-eyed visitor.
It is no wonder that at times they paused a while, spellbound by the majestic beauty of it all, humbled by its matchless grandeur, hushed by the sanctity of hallowed ground.
By the late 60s, there was more public concern about the environment, and Canadians began to look at their country in a new way. People began to worry that coastlines and rivers that had once seemed invulnerable to human impact were seriously threatened by pollution. This transformed the prospects for national parks.
I was interested a few years ago in getting out a bumper sticker. I thought we should have one that said, "Make Saskatchewan a national park." You know, this was proposed for the whole province of Nova Scotia at one time. And then it occurred to me, why not make Canada a national park?
9 proposals for new national parks were under consideration when the election of the Trudeau government in 1968 brought a new young minister to office.
I think that we need more parks in Canada, and we'll have more. I think that the public is aware of that, and they are putting pressure, and they should put pressure on us and on the provincial government. I know that if we move right now, we will be, the people who will be grateful, perhaps it will not be the people of today, it will be 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 generations from now.
An important part of Jean Chretien's initiative was the establishment of 3 national parks in northern Canada. The Nahanni National Park was created around the spectacular Nahanni River. Inaccessible by road, this was the first true wilderness park in the system and has since been named a World Heritage Site. Though the land in the north is Crown-owned, the creation of these parks allows for the eventual settlement of native land claims. Kluane National Park in the Yukon preserves one of the few remaining places in the world outside of the polar regions where we can observe the climatic conditions that existed during the last ice age 15,000 years ago. In these high mountains, this snow never melts, but turns to ice, which fills steep valleys to a depth of several thousands of feet. In glaciers, this ice slowly moves to lower levels. Filled with the debris of earth and rock gathered over hundreds of years, these glaciers eventually melt, releasing their moisture into small streams and rivers. The winds carry very little moisture into the interior, where the climate is dry and arid. In the south, this would be a desert. Yet because of the cold, the moisture is retained, and surprisingly, the lower slopes in spring and summer support a rich plant and animal life. Kluane has also been named a World Heritage Site.
Today, there is not many people who visit the park on Baffin land. It's a beautiful piece of land that had been set aside forever. But it might be that in 300 or 400 years from now, some guys will say there was a smart guy at that time. Nobody will know who was that guy. But you know, the fjords there are just fantastic. And I remember when I made a decision, I flew through that area many times, and I was like a kid. And I was sitting in the plane next to my wife, and I turned to my wife, I said, "I'll make it a national park for you."
But the new parks, of course, were for all Canadians. They extended to every region in the country, making the system truly national for the first time. Part of the west coast of Vancouver Island was set aside as the first new national park in British Columbia since 1922. There's a lot of stories about your time as minister, and for instance, I've heard that you played some political hardball with the provinces when you wanted to force a park through.
Yes, I had a lot of pleasure. One of them was in BC with Mr. Bennett, because, you know, that we were to take some good lumber and keep it aside forever. But he was a good politician, and he knew I was a politician, and he was playing games with me. So when I came to his office one day, I said, "Mr. Bennett, I have 2 speeches. One I say you're a great guy, the other one I say you're a son of a gun." And he laughed, and he said, "Okay, let's sign, John." And this is the way we got the Pacific Rim National Park.
The insistence on obtaining clear title to the land for parks now began to create real problems. Provincial governments had to assemble the land by expropriation and remove the former owners. When Pacific Rim was established, Darlene Choquette was a young dropout living near the beach in cabins kept by a woman who had been there for 35 years.
Well, this is mostly all of Singing Sands Camp here, all through this area, and you can see some of the remains here. The part of the stove here and the flowers, but she had cabins scattered throughout the forest. I just came for a holiday and never left. I was just captivated with the ocean. It was such a beautiful place, and Peg had this incredible spirit of hospitality.
Who was Peg?
Peg was the woman that owned the camp here, and her husband cleared this forest and made it into a camp that took in many, many people.
And then when the park was set up, what happened?
Well, when the park was set up, she had to leave. They didn't give her a choice, and it was heartbreaking for her. It was very, very difficult because of her age and because of the history here for her, the loss of her husband, her livelihood, her lifestyle, the people that came yearly. She didn't advertise. They simply came because they loved her, they loved the place, and it was like wrenching somebody out of their home and saying, you have to go. Well, I'm really pleased that we have a park that has prevented development, industrialization here. But I really still feel a certain amount of resistance myself to the way the park was brought about in this area. I think there are better ways of dealing with people in their homes, in their environment. And I think Peg, with her wonderful spirit, could have stayed here and died here. And that would have been the right way for her life.
This disruption of individual lives now became a point of bitter contention in an era of developing social activism. When the new National Park of Koujibakwak was proposed on the New Brunswick coast, more than 1,200 people were required to move. It was common in the late 60s for people, usually poor people, to be moved aside to make way for development. And in Kent County, New Brunswick, those who were expropriated for the national park were far from rich. Most of them were French-speaking Acadians who made a precarious living from the produce of the sea and forest. In this climate, new national parks were used as measures of economic development. Parks Canada wanted to preserve a remarkable stretch of coastline. Politicians hoped the park would bring jobs and prosperity. Louis Robichaud, former Premier of New Brunswick.
And I was extremely happy because it was in my own constituency. It was going to help my own people economically and otherwise. And I felt great about it. And everybody, when the announcement was made that properties were going to be taken and adequately paid for, and employment would be created in the area, people were ecstatic.
The New Brunswick Expropriation Act was a blunt instrument, and many people reacted strongly against the arbitrary way they were treated.
C'est ça, l'offre qu'ils m'ont fait, là, 6540 pièces. C'est ça le papier qu'ils m'ont fait. C'est ça le papier qu'ils m'ont donné ici. C'est ça le papier. Il n'y a pas d'écrit, il n'y a pas eu de papier de taipé, il n'y a pas eu de papier de loi de fait, plus que ça. Il n'y avait rien eu de fait de loi là.
He said, you can let it go to the board, in which you might get as much and you could get less. Oh, well, I said, maybe I wouldn't bother letting it go to the board. I said, oh, well, he said, if you don't let it go to the board, within 90 days, he said, you could get nothing. Puis je pense à moi-même, donc, puis, c'est là que j'aurais dû y donner mon point de vue dans la gueule, real quick.
Écoutez tous, petits et grands, la chanson d'un grand malheur. C'est l'histoire des pauvres.
The Acadians had bitter memories of a more historic expulsion, and as the first houses were moved away, they began to organize a resistance, giving expression to a growing bewilderment and anger. Supporters of expropriated people occupied government offices in the first demonstrations ever held against a national park. But while these troubles were brewing in the east, in Western Canada the public was now strongly committed in defense of national parks. In the 80 years since Banff was established, the mountain parks had proven to be successful as centres of conservation. With the predator control programs a thing of the past, wildlife of all kinds had multiplied. Environmentalists worried that economic development could damage the parks. And at the beginning of the 1970s, many people were outraged by a proposal to build a recreation village for 8,000 people at Lake Louise, in Banff National Park. The scheme was for a full-scale urban development, complete with shopping centres, hotels, and a superhighway. When an official inquiry was set up, the public responded vigorously. L. Davidson, Assistant Deputy Minister, Environment Canada.
The halls were overflowing, that people were outside. People were talking very strongly. There was even some violence in the back of the hall at one time. So they were pretty exciting events.
So there was a strongly expressed emotion in favor of preserving national parks at that time.
Yes, I think by far the majority of people there were against the big development and for preservation.
And as a result of that, the proposal was cancelled?
I think largely as a result of that, as I understand it, the minister decided that the public opinion was against it, and he cancelled it.
The protesters in the West were concerned to preserve the parks, in the East to preserve themselves. In August 1972, an agreement was signed with the province of Nova Scotia to create a national park at Ship Harbour, 40 miles east of Halifax. Once again, the idea was to preserve a superb coastline of islands, inlets, and harbours. As in Kujibaquak, people had been living in the area of the proposed park for many years. Several small communities were excluded, but many homes were marked for removal. The citizens found an articulate spokesman in Gordon Hammond, a young businessman who had arrived from Toronto only a year before. Hammond lived in an old house on Clam Harbour, and he wasn't ready to move without a fight.
There she be, a nice piece of Nova Scotia pine. When I read about it and I looked at the maps, I realized from the newspaper article that Clam Bay and Clam Harbour was scheduled to be wiped off the face of the earth. So I jumped in my truck and I drove around to my neighbours to tell them, and nobody believed me. And it was a few weeks later, then it became clear that was exactly what was intended. But people really didn't believe that anybody would propose to demolish an entire village.
Well, to be very truthful with the matter, I kind of laughed at it.
I fought for that little chunk of land I had, and I still got it, and it took me 16 years to get a roof over my head. Now, if they want to come get it, leave them come. I can't tell you what's going to happen when they come.
How are we going to make our opinions known? What are we going to do?
You can't lose. I would figure we would do to them what they do to us.
Well, we can't lose. If we fight, we can't lose anyway. We're going to lose.
Nothing to lose.
We're going to lose.
All we got to lose is our home.
Right.
The residents organised a committee of protest and worked successfully on public opinion. Cartoons such as this helped create a negative image of the proposal.
Oh, isn't that nice, dear? They're letting them live out their lives here.
Mr. Regan, when the people are here, would you answer this one question?
I'm going to see the committee inside now, and I want to again thank the great majority of you who have listened quietly for your courtesy on hearing me under these circumstances. Thank you.
Both federal and provincial governments were facing elections. They were reluctant to press the issue, and in December 1973, the Nova Scotia government decided not to proceed with Ship Harbour, but instead to set up a network of smaller provincial parks. In 4 years, 5 national parks were established in eastern Canada, including the first 2 ever in Quebec province, which had always been reluctant to transfer land to the federal government. To pull off this coup, Chretien orchestrated public opinion carefully. Of course, it was his own constituency.
Every hours or every day there was a slogan, we want the national parks in La Mauricie. It was terribly efficient. There was not a politician going there who was not asking if he was in favor or against the national park. And they got their national park.
It had now become clear that national parks could not be established over the objections of local people. And in the early 70s, important compromises in policy were made in the setting up of Gros Morne Park in Newfoundland. This park is on the west coast of the island, an area of small, isolated fishing outports with a near subsistence economy that comes to a halt in the winter. Originally, the park boundaries were drawn close around several villages. Traditional policies would have excluded the local people from gathering firewood and snaring rabbits as they had always done. To avoid this, the boundaries were moved further from the villages, and residents were permitted to use park lands as before, though hunting was forbidden. The wisdom of these changes was underlined by the continuing troubles at Coogee-Bequac. Most former landowners accepted increased compensation, but a few did not, and a handful moved back into makeshift cabins in the park under the leadership of a man called Jackie Vautour.
The government can keep their money and, buy themselves whatever they wish with it. We don't want their money. We want our rights, and we want our lands.
In the next few years, firearms were brandished, park visitors were sometimes threatened, shots were fired, park offices were attacked, and most wooden buildings in the park were burned down, including 2 valuable heritage structures. The protesters lost every court case they fought, but their supporters occupied park offices. They succeeded in closing the park, but only for a few days. Then, in a further attempt to bring the park to a halt, demonstrators attacked police. Such scenes were the antithesis of what national parks were intended for.
And at last report, at least half a dozen protesters have been arrested. Sandy McKean, CBC News.
Dismayed by these reactions, Parks Canada decided on major policy changes. They abandoned land expropriations and decided no longer to require vacant possession of all lands within proposed parks.
Do you think in retrospect you did it too quickly? Or?
I think that it was because we were too purist. The technician in the department felt that we had to own all the land and that there shall be no people living in the park. And I think that eventually we modified that.
I think it had a very positive effect in terms of it forced Parks Canada to seriously address what it was they were doing, because this was not just one occurrence here. I mean, every single province in the Maritimes had its own particular battle going on.
We don't set up national parks anymore unless there's clear local support. We don't intend to move people. We don't intend to expropriate lands. So there's been quite a major shift in policy since that time. I think largely stemming from the unhappy results of the policy. Of course, good national parks were set up.
15 years later, Coogee-Bequac has been accepted by the public in Kent County, whose economy has been greatly improved as the politicians hoped. The park attracts more than 250,000 visitors a year, and in spite of the troubles, has been a year-round success. The new policies had a major impact on a proposed national park in the Grasslands of Saskatchewan, a windswept, parched region quite unlike any other place in Canada.
Yeah, they just come back to have their young. See, they're born there young in August.
The people here are ranchers, fierce individualists with a great attachment to their rugged land. Under the new policy, the establishment of any park here depends on their voluntary decision to sell.
They're born there young, and when they're a coil position, they can strike out 3/4 of their length and back the coil in half second.
Vernon and Lise Perrault were born in this country after their parents moved west from Quebec earlier in this century.
They're young are anywhere to 15 to 35 in one litter. The minute they're born, they're on their own. They're little guys about, 3-4 inches long. They only got one little black rattle. They can't make no noise because they got to have two bells to shake. And them little snakes, they tell us 3 hours after they're born, they're just as poisonous as the big ones.
Most of this area has escaped the plough because of its irregular terrain and low rainfall. So it still has the original grasses, plants and animals that were here before the arrival of Europeans.
Our country is very delicate, something like they say the tundra is. It's so dry. If you go up our badlands 2 or 3 times with vehicles, it marks up the country. And then there's a lot of our birds and plants and animals that have gone, and they have plowed up a lot of our native prairie land.
Well, the naturalists started talking about National Grasslands Park about 25 years ago. But we didn't ever get around to doing anything very actively until about 20 years ago, when we passed a resolution and asked the federal and provincial governments to create such a park.
Dr. Ledingham represented Saskatchewan naturalists in public hearings on the park proposal. Parks Canada now recognized that the support of the local people was essential. Hundreds made their views known to a committee of inquiry. The locals generally favored the park, but this careful and conciliatory approach slowed the process. In addition, provincial governments had become more reluctant than ever before to hand over land. When the formal agreement was signed in 1981, another 7 years were granted the province to explore for oil and gas. The new policies had more than doubled the time it takes to establish a national park. Larry Dupe of Parks Canada.
Why has it taken so long?
The very fact, I guess, you're dealing with people. You're dealing with something, ranching, that's been going on here for quite some time. You're dealing with people's livelihoods. You're dealing with bureaucracy when you're dealing with 2 levels of government. Political things, just...
But even with all those things, 20 years seems an inordinate amount of time to set up a park.
Yes, it does. And I'm sure most people here will hardly agree with that.
Yeah.
You know, it don't take 20 years to make a land sale.
Well, that it's taken them so long to do anything, and I feel that we haven't, they don't pay any attention to us sometimes.
They played with our lives a lot. I think that if they did not want the park, they should have said so. And if they want the park, they should get at it, not dally around like that for so many years.
Yeah, it's all political. The whole battle has been political.
All of these people have been in favor of the park for many years. In fact, they formed a committee to press for the park, but they have been frustrated by the delays. 14 federal and provincial elections have brought repeated changes in the political support for the park. Some of the land is owned privately, but most is provincial crown land on long-term lease to the ranchers. Some ranchers are willing to sell their interest. Others do not even want to discuss it.
In the West Block, there's approximately 17 ranches. We can buy enough land to create a park. It's likely, though, that there will be some ranches within the park area who may never sell. That is not necessarily a bad thing, because ranching is a way of life, and I think it can add, in fact, to the values of the park.
The Saskatchewan naturalists originally wanted 2,600 square kilometres of land to preserve a grassland ecosystem.
Back through here.
20 years later, in 1984, Parks Canada bought its first land, a ranch of 130 square kilometres. A new warden is shown his territory by Superintendent Larry Dupe.
So pretty well everything you can see is the Larson Ranch. It's 46 sections in total, so it's a fair size.
During the many years of negotiation, the size of the park had been scaled down to a maximum of 900 square kilometres.
Looking forward to it?
You bet, yeah, sure am.
Yeah. Are you disappointed?
Well, I feel fairly certain there will eventually be a Grassland National Park, but I think it will not be as good as we thought it would be in our early enthusiasm.
Grasslands will be set up, is being set up. It's being set up with the support of the local people. In the long pull, people will say it's a great park, and hopefully in the long pull, people will forget that it took all that time to set it up, because it won't look like a long time if one looks back on it 100 years from now.
Parks Canada has now adopted a plan for future expansion of the national park system. Canada has been divided into 39 land regions, and the aim is to have at least one national park in each region to ensure the survival of all major ecosystems. The 31 existing national parks represent only half of these regions, so the system requires 21 new parks to be completed.
Well, it's an ambitious plan. It's a finite plan, though. There is an end to it. As it stands now, it would require about 10 new national parks in the north and 10 in the provincial areas to finish it. Now, that may sound like a lot, but we brought on, in the last 15 years, we brought on a dozen new national parks, so that it's perhaps not too ambitious to think about bringing on another 10 or so in the next 15 years.
A new federal government elected in 1984 has reaffirmed completion of this plan as an important priority. The southern part of Moresby Island and the Queen Charlotte's off the west coast is one of several areas proposed as parks. Here, an environmental group has fought a lively campaign for creation of a new park. Spokesman for the Islands Protection Society is Jack Miller.
I think we're making headway. I've got a feeling that good hope that we'll win. I think that the government will see that there's a lot of people who want to see the area preserved, and I think the government will probably react favorably. Maybe not to the largest extent, but I think we'll get a major portion of it saved.
The southern islands in the Charlottes were once inhabited by the Haida, one of the finest Indian cultures on the continent, but they were forced by disease to abandon their villages in the 1880s. Since then, the area has been virtually uninhabited, though the Haida still claim Aboriginal ownership of it. Having never been cut, this forest has evolved almost uninterrupted since the last ice age. This makes it unusual in the complexity that has developed within it over thousands of years. When such a forest is removed, this biological diversity is lost forever. Various logging companies have been granted leases by the provincial government over the timber. Gradually, their operations are spreading southwards into untouched forests.
Well, if this area is logged, it will become just the same as any other area in British Columbia that has been logged. It'll become genetically impoverished. It'll be short on a lot of species that exist only in old-growth forests. It'd be really an awful shame to see it logged.
We're going to see other species of crabs here, so what I want you to learn today is how to tell the males from the females, the boys from the girls. So when you flip this guy over and you look at the abdomen here, this abdominal plate, it looks somewhat like a lighthouse. So this is a male. This is one of the edible crabs. It's a smaller than the Dungeness crab that you'll find in the sandy.
Bill McIntyre, a Parks Canada naturalist from Vancouver Island, is an enthusiast for the South Moresby area, which is so rich biologically that it's been called the Galapagos of the North. At low tide, the narrows between the various islands are full of starfish, clams, mussels, crabs, and many other creatures. Parks Canada believes this beautiful area should be preserved and has suggested to the British Columbia government creation of a national marine and provincial park.
I know there's about 10 underneath this puddle of water.
What's that?
Those are little barnacles. Just barnacles. Just a cluster of it's a different species of barnacle than the big ones we were showing you before. Well, the coast is not going to be preserved unless people get here to see it. And that's the only way that you're going to have preservation. Somebody has to love this place in order for the preservation to happen. And if nobody's loving it, then the logging company wins.
It is possible, therefore, that one day the hot springs in the Charlottes might be preserved in a park, just as were those of Banff a century ago. In these 100 years, the national park system has grown from 10 square miles to more than 50,000, the number of visitors from a few hundred to 25 million a year. For all of this century, the national parks have sought to maintain a balance between the conservation of nature and the public's right of access, between the needs of the present and those of the future. As the 2nd century began, a new minister affirmed protection of the superb landscapes within the national parks as his first priority. Canadians have made it clear to their governments that they want much of their country to remain as nature created it. Future choices, of course, will continue to be difficult. But Canada already has one of the world's finest systems of national parks, built by the commitment and vision of the Canadian people. Today, as always in the past, the future of the national parks is in the hands of the present generation.
On our coastline, they almost extincted the whale, the sea otter.
Some of the things you see in the Charlottes are truly incredible.
If we tear off the whole fabric of the earth, all the living fabric, disrupt it all.
As the forest disappears, we lose. It's immeasurable what we lose.
We've written thousands of letters, over 15,000 of you.
It's worth preserving it for some people to be able to see and some people just to know it's there.
We share the planet with a lot of other things, and they've got to have a place.
Crown, we own the land. That's Crown land.
I think there's an arrogance on the part of man.
Please sign our telegram.
It's not fair that we should use up all of our resources and leave nothing for our children to see.
It's not too late. It's not too late.